Hi guys, let me start by saying that I hugely appreciate both of your work and have been following it and been a fan, and I tend to be more critical in my comments because I approach this from a very pragmatic point of view, which is if I was to share what I agree with you, I don't think you can take really that much out of it. And if it's something where my view just diverges, I don't even know whether to call this a kind of criticism. It's simply I see things differently. Then you might have a look at it and see, this might make sense if I put it into my view and then adapt it a little bit. That's how I approach it. I approach it from a very pragmatic point of view, which on the other hand has the disadvantage that I can't really make visible how much I appreciate what you both are doing and how important I find what you both are doing. So I hope that everything else that I'm saying now is read against this background and not viewed as an attempt at a deconstructive criticism or something. So let me start with trying to summarize your position. As far as I get you, your fear is that the intellectual dark web runs the risk of falling apart and becoming open to ideologies that are highly problematic if it doesn't figure out how to distinguish the wheat from the chaff, if it doesn't systematically find out how to distinguish pre-conventional ideologies that simply cannot live up to the complexities of our present life, and are trying to make things more simple and too simple in many cases. How to distinguish those from truly post-conventional practices, which are a way into the future and can deal with the complexity of the world that is surrounding us. And as far as I see, what you're saying is that this is a general problem with the intellectual dark web, something which the intellectual dark web has to figure out. It has to find a methodology of distinguishing post-conventional from pre-conventional thought, because not everything that is different or that is countercultural as such necessarily is post-traditional or a way forward. Most of it actually is not. Most of it is a regression back into simplistic ideologies. And Dave Rubin, I guess, I suspect it's not about Dave Rubin for you either. I think you're seeing Dave Rubin as representative of this kind of problem, where he seems to be someone who is not really aware of how, well, to put it in Wilberian terms, he's not really aware of the pre-rational, post-rational distinction. To him, everything that is running counter the leading culture is post-rational, so to say, and must be good and equally good. In other words, he's not really aware of developmental thinking and not really seeing how pre-conventional views are simply not at the same level of complexity and at the same level of embracing the world as post-conventional views are, even though they both might share the fact of being unconventional. That's why I see your criticism at Dave Rubin coming from, and you both suggest that he try to be more rigorous in distinguishing problematic ideologies and regressive ideologies from truly from views that are really a way into the future. And you both suggest that he build this into his way of interviewing people, where he's more critical of them and try to challenge them more, to be more critical of their views. And I guess you would agree with the documentary that you sent me, that he doesn't really live up to his own standards, that he is not actually making visible what people think, but that he's being used by pretty smart and media-apt strategists to pretend they're someone they're actually not. They're making use of him and saying things that actually don't correspond to what they're actually thinking. And it would be the job of a good journalist, at least of a good journalist, to really dig deep and find where these views are really actually coming from, what their background is, and what the most obvious criticism is, what the most obvious limitations of these views are. In a nutshell, I think this is where your criticism at Dave Rubin is coming from. And again, I don't think you are emphasizing it because Dave Rubin is so important. I think you're emphasizing it because it's important for the IDW, and it's expressive of a more general problem in the IDW, and it's not really clear how to deal with this in the future. I agree with you on the part that this distinction between pre-conventional and post, I mean, you didn't use the terms, but I assume coming from the same background with knowing integral theory and so forth, you would accept this kind of distinction in this context of speaking about pre-conventional views, views that don't live up to distinctions that are apt for the complexity of our world, and post-conventional views, views that actually go beyond the limits of convention. In this context, I assume you would accept this distinction as something meaningful. I agree that this is a crucial problem for the intellectual dark web, but I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've gotten so far. The only thing that I think we have achieved so far, or we have seen being done so far, is to realize that if you want to try to understand complex worldviews and complex thinkers, you can't do so in 5 to 10 minute segments as are usually sent through traditional media. You have to use the long formats that Dave Rubin or Sam Harris or Joe Rogan are using. So the only thing that I see the IDW people agreeing around so far is that they usually see that people are simply, generally speaking, not stupid. That as you mentioned in the article, all of them have a signal. I think using a quote here from Jordan Hall, all of them have a signal, and to find this kind of signal, and for this you need a getting together of people, and you need a long format to discuss issues. I think this is what the IDW so far has been basically gathering around, and this is what got such a huge momentum. I mean, the idea that the two people with radically opposing views, like Peterson or Zizek, could get together and talk for more than 2 hours, this seems something new, and people get a lot of value out of it. Or that, for example, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson could get together, who again have also very diverging views, but simply can get a little bit across of the complexity of their minds. I think this is the really new thing, and this is what the intellectual dark web has been introducing here, is suggesting this new kind of format. Now the next step is, of course, what in integral language, speaking in integral language, the question, well, what do you exclude and what do you integrate? And I don't think this is a trivial question. I think this is hugely challenging. And the problem I had with both your suggestions was that it can be solved on the level of taking personal responsibility. It can be solved on the level of someone just being smart enough, someone developing and becoming embracing enough to see these distinctions and build them into a narrative and tell people what is right from what is wrong. Now, Integral tried this with Ken Wilber, and I think it didn't work. For many reasons. What am I saying here? What Wilber tried to do is he tried this integration and exclusion process all by himself. He locked himself up, he studied these various disciplines, and it was him in the end who was deciding what to include and what to exclude. And it never really got to becoming a collaborative process where others could contribute and say, well, look at that, you should really have a look at that and contribute. This was one of the major criticisms that was labeled, I think one of the major valid criticisms at Integral, that it never really became a social engagement, a social project, but basically was one person centered from the start until now, basically. And I think this is in the nature of things. This is built into these big projects where you try to bring together so many different disciplines and so many different viewpoints. The old traditional way of approaching this, the way the philosophers have been doing it, and the way that Wilber tries to solve it, is to lock themselves in a room, to distance themselves from society, to get into a state of theoria, which is a state of observing, and to figure out the truth. to figure out that which really makes sense, to then distinguish with their own heads, in their own minds, to then distinguish the wheat from the chaff. This is the way that we have been doing it with philosophers have been doing it since at least Plato, with the idea of the philosopher kings, where the philosopher kings are those who inform you. They should be those who give you the right kind of information. The top-down approach, where there is one who is knowing and gets it all right and has all the responsibility, because he really has to figure it all out and create a unified vision, a unified picture that figures it all out up into the details. And this person, this philosopher king, doesn't only define politics, but he also defines your entire worldview. He informs you about what to believe, and he informs you about what not to believe. He tells you what the good, the true, and the beautiful are. This is the old way we have been doing it, and up to a certain degree, this is also how Wilber, for example, approached this. In the end, it was him telling you what the good, the true, and the beautiful are, and coming up with a unified version of what to integrate and what to exclude. I think this is very similar to what Jordan Peterson has been doing, and you, David, have been... one of the criticisms that you labeled at Jordan Peterson was exactly this, that you said the problem is that Jordan Peterson doesn't see that he's not alone in this, but there are many people who really want to help. And the next step would be, the next question would be, how can you include those people so that they can make a meaningful contribution? Because the stage we're at right now is that there's just no way for any kind of bottom-up, bottom-top communication, if you will, to make any kind of meaningful, reasonable contribution from the bottom up. Either you are a pundit and you lock yourself up and you study your whole life and you can speak at the level of Jordan Peterson, at the level of complexity, I mean, or you're basically nobody. There is like nothing in between. There is no way of really making a meaningful contribution to the big picture, because there are no channels. There is no way you can really reasonably get in touch with these opinion leaders and point them to something which would make a difference in their views. I mean, ask Jordan Peterson, for example, when was the last time he learned something? When was the last time that he learned something from someone in these Q&A sessions, or from someone on the internet, or from even from academic friends? I think these moments are very rare, and I can't go into why I think this is systematically so and necessarily so, but I think this is one of the crux problems that we have to address. How can we make these old big picture approaches more sociable, more how can we, in other words, as Jordan Hall would say, how can we distribute intelligence here? Because this has worked in so many areas, but it doesn't seem to work in these picture approaches, which are usually in the responsibility of the humanities. It hasn't worked so far to create systems where we can meaningfully create narratives by sharing, by distributing responsibilities and come up with something meaningful. It hasn't worked, and we're still dependent on people to figure it out alone, thinkers to figure it out alone and tell us what to do. And it's obviously that Dave Rubin cannot be the person to do this. But what I'm saying is that nobody can do it. Not only Dave can't do it, nobody else, neither you, David, can do it. There's just no way for you to go beyond your own bias and become this blank slate which is totally open and totally transparent for the different perspectives that then arise, and show them from a neutral point of view. I don't think this, approaching this from, let me put it in a different way. The traditional way of dealing with this is the suggestion that the journalist, very similar to the philosopher, has the responsibility to distinguish the meaningful from the less meaningful, the problematic from that which has goodness, truth, and beauty in it. And I think this has never really worked, because this is a far too high burden to put on people. Just think of your interview with Ken Wilber, for example. People could have said, oh, wait a minute, but why didn't you play the devil's advocate? Why didn't you really jump into the details of that? Why didn't you ask Ken, for example, why he's basing his philosophy on the Philosophia Perennis, for example? That's a very minority view. Why didn't you ask Ken about his notion of eros? Why didn't you ask Ken about his Burpee episodes? Why didn't you could have gone in so many ways where critics would have wanted you to go, And yet, on the other hand, you would have had others who would say, well, wait a minute, this is not representative of Kant's thought. This is a total misrepresentation of Kant's thought if you had gone there. You can't really appease all the different specialized perspectives that come to the defense when we're discussing very detailed issues. And I don't think it would have been your responsibility to go there. We have to go there. I just don't think the setting of an interview or the setting of presenting someone's views is this context. Of course, we should have a place where we can discuss these problematic issues and where we can discuss specific views and test their validity. So what I'm suggesting is that we, additionally to the kind of space that Dave Rubin is creating, because the kind of space that he's creating is, it's like a living room where you just meet someone and you have a first talk to them. And you're just friendly. It's just nothing more and nothing less. Additionally to that space, of course, we need spaces where we can test ideologies and where we can really press people. But this is not a space where journalists would be active. This is not a place where a journalist can actually competently contribute anything to that. This is a place where you really need to bring these specialized views with other specialists who disagree. This is not something that a journalist can do. And my suggestion is on a much more structural level. My suggestion is, instead of focusing on what an individual could do in this case to tell you what the right and the wrong is, why not focus on methodologies that will make it more easy for observers to figure out themselves what is problematic and what is not? Like, to give you one example, what about if the people who are invited to these shows also have to provide, for example, their sources. If they have to provide the books they have read, or if they have to provide the passages that they have taken out of these books, what if they have to make much more transparent where their view is actually coming from? This is something that they have to provide as additional material. This is a structural suggestion that I'm making now. It doesn't really change what you as a journalist are doing, but it changes the structure of what kind of interaction is happening plays with you, because you're forcing people to use a specific kind of medium. You're forcing people to do certain things that make transparent their views, whether they want it or they don't. And I think this kind of solution is something that can really work into the future, because it really takes much less intellectual effort from any individual, and makes it much more easy to spot inconsistencies and to spot problematic views. So I'm just giving you a hint here where I'm coming from and how I'm framing all this. So what I'm saying is that my criticism so far was, I don't think the problem of distinguishing the wheat from the chaff, answering the question what to integrate and what to not integrate, can be solved by an individual in a significantly satisfactory way. I think it's something where we have to take an entirely different path if we want to get anywhere. Again, it's the path of distributed intelligence, and it's the path of bringing together different spaces that have different responsibilities. The space that David Rubin is creating is not a space where you have the responsibility of digging up every single detail and discussing highly specialized topics in minuscule detail. It's just not that space. But we have a responsibility of bringing that space as close as possible to a space which is about these details, and this again to a space which is about confronting people with views they strongly disagree. This is a much more structuralist approach to this problem of distinguishing the wheat from the chaff, and I think it's something that is scalable, because the other approach has never been scalable. The other approach has basically always assumed that for it to work, I mean, this old philosophical approach, it basically assumed that for it to work, all people must become philosophers. All people must become not only enlightened, but also ultimately informed on everything. This is the only way this model can work without friction. Otherwise, you always will end up in some kind of tyranny. And this structuralist approach, on the other hand, tries to apply what has so far been working in part in software development or the hard sciences, to apply this to the humanities, where you're much more successful at distributing intelligence, and don't end up in this old way of doing it like we've been doing it in the humanities, which is you have this one thinker, they lock themselves up, they make these big pictures, they figure it all out, and they tell the world how it is, and then the world has to follow. The world has to adapt itself to this big picture. That's where I'm coming from. I don't think this will work, and if the IDW takes this path, it will very soon fall apart, because right now already the thinkers that are in the IDW are too diverse. They have far too refined individual pictures, and I don't see them having the time to spend with each other to figure out the one right way of approaching all of this. I don't think this will work, and it didn't work with Integral, obviously. Even though Integral is a highly abstract model that really leaves a lot of space for disagreement and for approaching views from different perspectives. So I hope this gives you at least a basic hint of where I'm coming from with my critique, and I really hope you find ways of distributing intelligence, because this is crucially important. How can we make it possible for people to contribute, even if they haven't read like 1,000 books? And let me close with Jordan Peterson's criticism of postmodernism to maybe exemplify what I'm talking here. Peterson is, when he's speaking about postmodernism, he is not speaking about a set of ideas that only a few academics are actually aware of. He's speaking about a phenomenon that is pretty widely spread. He has made explicit what the major distinctions or the major ideas or metaphors are that this movement or this kind of mental frame is using. Like the one of these basic distinctions is the idea that there is no truth. Another one is that there is no human being. There is no good human being, the right kind of being human, or the best way. What has been called the metaphysics of authenticity, this old pre-modern idea that there is one right way of being a human being. You can actually fail this goal of being a human being. You can actually have a form of guilt, and you have a responsibility to realize this goal of being a human being, of the best human being possible, something that's also very built into integral theory, that there is a best version of yourself that you can develop. What he calls postmodernism rejects this idea. Another issue is, for example, the demand for precision. So whenever you point out some kind of causal connection between something, what usually he calls postmodernism will return with the answer, with the question, well, wait a minute, is there any kind of actual precision behind what you're telling me? So is this a mere correlation, or is there a kind of causational link between these phenomena that you're pointing to? And postmodernism goes as far as to actually say that the kind of connections that the hard sciences are actually talking about, things as laws, are actually no hard connections. There are no necessary connections, but basically constructs and ideas applied onto reality and attempts to make a diverse reality uniform. This is the very extreme form. Now, whatever you want to call that, this is a set of ideas that is self-replicating, or that really doesn't need people to read much. In other words, Peterson can't give you the Marxists, but the statistics that he's quoting can't give you the Marxists either. In other words, the people who are using these ideas to grasp the world, they themselves don't know the sources. Those who know the sources, people like Zizek, for example, they have an entirely different understanding of what postmodernism in this specific context, or Marxism in different contexts actually means. And both are real. The level of low resolution, big cultural memes is real. Memes are real ways of making sense that are spread over vast cultural spaces, is something that is real, and you can feel it. You can feel that there are specific distinctions that people make, and they make it generally speaking and reliably speaking. This is the level from which Peterson is coming from, and what he's addressing with the notion of postmodernism. So what he's talking about is not a specialized literature that only a few people understand, but it's a set of ideas that you can find everywhere around you. It's a set of metaphors that everyone uses. Metaphors like, for example, the metaphor, the distinction up, down, for example. This is something that even integral theory uses as a basic distinction, or the distinction a whole and a part. These are distinctions that you'll find in any kind of culture, that you will find anywhere. And local cultures have such basic metaphors that they use to make sense of the world, that all of the participants share at least in a family resemblance kind of way, as Wittgenstein has been using the word. So this is the perspective from which Peterson is coming in approaching the problem of postmodernism. And given this context, testing whether he's right about postmodernism or he's maybe just creating a straw man won't be done by reading the sources and checking his claims with the sources, whether he's done the right reading of the literature, but it will be done by a qualitative, at best I think the only way of doing it is doing a qualitative kind of way of research where you just try to work out the metaphors that, given specific context, like the context of academic writing and particularly the humanities, what are the basic metaphors that are being used again and again to explain phenomena. And only on this level could you then either agree with him or disagree with him. It's obvious that Peterson only has a basic sense here. He's sensing, he's feeling something. He doesn't really have a hard research to really prove it, only a few statistical hints, if you want, but nothing really hard. The other extreme is the very diversified and highly differentiated views of the highly specialized academics, where only a few people hold specific views. And again, they also use their own metaphors, they also use their own language, but you couldn't really say that they really have an influence on the broader kind of culture. And what I'm saying is that you have to distinguish these two different levels of resolution, if you want, when you're talking about phenomena, and what the job of opinion leaders or cultural leaders is in general is to have a sense for both. They have to have a sense for the general trends. They have to have a sense where humanity is at large. And this is the big pictures in which Ken Wilber is, for example, speaking, and where he felt specific developments a few decades ago. He was actually speaking about this pluralist trend and the kinds of pathologies that Peterson has been describing. He is basically describing this like literally almost 2 decades ago, long before they become so vastly popular, because he was feeling these kinds of connected or coherent thought systems or metaphorical systems that then attempt to spread and govern the world. And the other aspect is you also have to be able to cover the more specialized, individualized perspectives and be able to follow up on the highly differentiated individual perspectives. But I think none of both a journalist can do. I think none of both, even an intellectual or an academic that devotes their lives to it, can do. And not alone. It just doesn't work. You have to make use of distributed intelligence to get it both right, because both of them are a challenge. It's the one thing which is a challenge to get this big picture sense for where we are at as a humanity, or where we are as a global culture. This is something that takes a lot of reading, but it also takes a lot of distributed intelligence pointing you at the right spots to look. Otherwise you will be lost in noise. And the other area, which is the highly specialized discourse, just as much takes not only diligence and looking at the details, but it also takes being embedded in a specific community that really helps you to figure out the right kind of details. And this is not something that a journalist could ever do. This is not something that you could expect from a journalist, and this is not something that you could expect from a Dave Rubin. It just doesn't make sense. And for me, the problematic issue with the documentary that you sent me to watch, the problematic issue was that it didn't really frame right what Rubin was trying to do. And I think Rubin is much more humble in what I believe he truly thinks he's doing. I think what he thinks he's doing, he's basically getting together with people and having a talk. That's his space. And he sees his responsibility end there, because there are other spaces where people can academically dissect what is being then said. And another problem which I found to be a an issue in this documentary is that, well, I wasn't that surprised that it was basically assumed, and it was smuggled in the end of the documentary, the assumption that well, he's subconsciously or consciously basically doing all this for money, because he has found he's like basically a genius who knows how what people want to hear, and he's perfectly prepared. No, this is in Pejoram Patim interpretation now here. He's basically predicting what people want to hear, and that's why he's making the setting so that it will fit their intuitions, and he will speak to their feelings. And so we ended up in exactly the kind of ideology that I think the IDW has been agreed is a bit problematic. If you assume that people have this kind of motive and that they are these kind of geniuses that they're really not concerned with these problems, and what they're actually after is making money. And this was one of the subtle, or not so subtle actually, claims at the end of the documentary. You're ending up in exactly the kind of ideology that I think the IDW was very skeptical of, in reducing people down to basically being nothing else but slaves to economical pre-assumptions or to economical systems that they're themselves not aware of, and not taking them by their actual word, and not taking them as subjects who have something individually important to contribute to the whole thing. So I would want to summarize this. The basic idea that I want to share is not that I think that that Dave is particularly successful at distinguishing the wheat from the chaff, and that he has not introduced problematic views. He certainly has, but I feel that the reason he has not been able to introduce as many liberal views, I guess, if I have to shoot blindly here, my guess really is it's because the liberal views just don't want to get together with him, and because, as he rightly points out, they assume he must be the devil because he's speaking to people that they strongly disagree with, and they hold to be highly problematic, to be highly problematic views. I suspect this has more to do with the actual situation than Dave consciously choosing not to speak to liberals. He just recently spoke to Andrew Yang, and they had a perfectly reasonable discussion, and he didn't treat him in any way differently from anybody else. But again, it's not about Dave Rubin. I also don't think that it's a reasonable way to expect from individuals to solve the problem of distinguishing the wheat from the chaff. I think this is a path that we have to figure out collectively, and where we have to put in mechanisms to use. I'm not sure how Sam Harris called this, but Sam Harris it was the context of speaking about morality, and he was basically saying that Peterson has this idea that if we today were embedded in the same kind of socio-economical circumstances of the past, we would actually be responsible for the same atrocities that the Nazis were. We're not different. We have the devil in every single one of us, and we have to face that kind of shadow, and we have to own it, and we have to become aware of it, instead of searching it in the others. And Sam's suggestion was that he's very pessimistic on human beings becoming more moral in the course of time, and showing more moral spine. But what he hopes for is fail-safe systems, so that, in other words, the systems that we build in the future make it much more difficult for us to really commit such atrocities or make the wrong moral decisions, where it simply becomes more and more easy to do the right thing, just as it becomes more and more easy to think the right thought, to do the good, to get at the true, and to also to get at the beautiful. And I think this systems approach has much more potential in it than the old way of trying to meticulously show and point out how someone is right or how someone is wrong. Again, looking at the interview with Ken Wilber, I think there are like dozens of different ways you could approach him, and they all contradict themselves, and at the end you would have an entirely different view of what Ken Wilber is saying, and yet they're all out there, and they would all feel like they have been misrepresented if you, as an interviewer, David, had tried to give a fair perspective. this very idea that we can have a fair and a balanced view is this old kind way of thinking that you can have a point from nowhere or a perspective from nowhere, which I don't think will help us in the future to deal with the kind of complexity that we're dealing with. And all it will do is basically, again, reduce complexity down into a narrow and a flat narrative that makes us feel like we have figured things out, but in the end it's nothing but a form of ideology. And ideologies, this is what I think we have learned with the IDWs. Ideologies can take like any shape, they can take any kind of content, they can come in any kind of disguise, and we have no guarantee that they really make us be in touch with reality and the good, the true, and the beautiful.